So we got a reading response coming tonight. Some of you have already written me asking for extensions. I will give them to all of you, even if you have really no legitimate excuse. If you do ask for an extension, tell me when you want to turn it in, right? Because that's sort of part of the deal. You got to say, hey, I can't do it tonight, but I can do it by X date. And if it's like, next week, I'll probably say no. How about Saturday, right? Or something like that. Or tomorrow even. In fact, I don't know if you noticed this. If you turn in things late, I leave the window open for 24 hours, so I don't even notice if it's late. Actually, I do notice. It tells me what time it's turned in, but I don't care if it's late. But if it's beyond 24 hours, you do have to email it to me in order for me to get it. So anyways, I haven't responded to all of you because I've had a busy few days. I'm always busy, it seems. But yeah, if you need an extension, you can take it. That being said, tonight's the deadline. If you can do it tonight, please just do it. And we will talk about this very question today. So we kind of covered half of it. We've really covered both sides last week when we went over Tara and the headspace meditation. There's a similar sort of comparison being made here, but we'll make it more explicit today. So we're going to go into Buddhist magic, which is a relatively new book. Let's see, where's my book? Here's my book. Maybe you saw I posted a review that I wrote of this book. So the publisher contacted me and asked me to write a review. Actually, it was a journal contacted me on behalf of the publisher to write a review, so I did it. And I figured since we're reading it, I might as well share it with you guys. You don't have to read it if you don't want to, but it's kind of my hot take on the book. What does it mean to call a tradition magic, that sort of thing. So if you're into it, you can see what I do, and you'll see that these reading responses I give to you are kind of on the same continuum with that academic work, right? I'm not just doing this because I like giving you guys work, right? This is a skill. It's to read a book and have a take, right? Read a book and have a thought about it. And so I'm trying to teach you how to do that. And you can, see my work and you can give me a grade if you want to too. 5 out of 5, 4 out of 5 on this book review. I'll leave it up to you. So anyways, what is the question you got to deal with? Basically, Buddhist modernism versus Buddhist magic. As you can probably tell from last class, the way I set it up, I'm trying to make you rethink Buddhist modernism a little bit, right? We're all predisposed to think, oh yeah, meditation, that's pretty cool. I guess, yeah, we can look at what is Buddhist modernism all about? Again, it's this modern reform of Buddhism, this emphasis on like an original or pure teaching. I think we talked about this. Like, was the Buddha really a historical figure, and what did he really teach? We want to know that. Why do we want to know that? I don't really know, but we do, right? We want to know actually, I have some ideas about why, but I don't know for sure. We want the original real teachings. We want the original real teachings of Jesus too, not those later corruptions that those medieval people put in. We want the real stuff, the original stuff, right? And that's kind of what the Protestant Reformation was about. So some people call this Protestant Buddhism. That I think is a bit of a loaded term, and we'd have to think about what that really means. But this idea of a reform, right, is certainly speaking to Protestant sensibilities, let's say. So we want the pure original teaching. We want it to be rational and scientific, right? We're modern people. We like rational scientific things. The prompt is about COVID. We want to respond to COVID rationally and scientifically. Do you guys respond to COVID rationally and scientifically? It's kind of an interesting question, right? And this is one reason I'm highlighting magic is because I've read, there's a guy named Ed Young. Do you know who he is? He writes for The Atlantic. If you want good coverage of COVID, look him up. I'll put him in the chat. He's an excellent writer, Ed Young. Anyways, he accused the American government, the American response, as being magical thinking. And I was reading this book for the first time at that time. I was like, wait a minute, magical thinking, that's the same word, right? How is this word being used? So that kind of inspired this class. But we like rational and scientific thinking, right? Are masks rational and scientific? Obviously, we all think so. Our administrators think so. Some people in America don't think so, right? Some people in America think they're bad for some reason, and that's another sort of interesting question. All right, so collapsing of monks and lay people. I'm not a monk, and yet I'm teaching Buddhism. That's bizarre. In the history of Buddhism, there are lay teachers, for sure. But this kind of systematic collapsing of what used to be sort of the monastic scholar role, the fact that I can be a layperson and a scholar of Buddhism at the same time is pretty new, right? And again, it's kind of in line with the development of the modern university. What is the modern university? 1,000 years ago, it was the monastery. Full stop, right? The earliest universities, like in Italy, for example, are often of a religious character, let's say. Again, I'm not an expert of these things, but I went to, I think it's in Padua, one of the earliest universities. I'm pretty sure it's Padua. I was just being a tourist and looking around, but I was struck. Here's this like nearly 1,000-year-old university. There's a scholar who at least proposes that those come from Muslim institutions of Quranic education, and then those are related to Indian institutions of Buddhist education, and that all of these sort of scholastic traditions are tied together. And so I think our very institution, right, even though there's a long history, long complicated history, is also tied to being monks and nuns. But obviously we are not monks and nuns, we are lay people. And so we sort of collapse these two roles. And then meditation, right? This idea that meditation is a cure for the universal ills of modernity, right? What is the universal ill of modernity? Did we talk about that? I think I cut that slide, so I can't point to it. But remember the Chicago World's Parliament of Religions, right? We had the kind of first representation of Buddhism as this scientific religion. One of the speakers there said, there's this universal ill, and the Dharma, but we could say more specifically, meditation is a cure for this universal ill. What is the ill of modernity? Does modernity bring any special ills? What do you guys think? What is Headspace trying to sell you? What is the universal ill for Headspace? So you guys remember? Should I just search for it? I was showing my friend this Headspace meditation last night. He was actually teaching a very similar class to what we were covering. And I was like, here's this cool video. You guys can talk about it. Stress. Remember stress? Is stress a special ill of modernity? It kind of is, right? Before the 20th century, maybe the late 19th, but really 20th century, people didn't talk about stress. Stress is a metaphor. You guys aware of this? Even though stress is biologically proven to be like a real thing, if you're stressed out, you can have physiological effects. What it really refers to is it's a machine, right? As machines break down, it's what causes a machine to break, basically. Friction, stress, right? So it is a metaphor. It's comparing our bodies to machines. Without the concept of a machine, we can't have this concept of stress. This is a new invention. And so along with it comes the promise for a cure of this stress. And again, I don't mean to say stress isn't real. It is very real. And yet, it is also a metaphor, which is to say, some metaphors, at least, are very real. Okay, so meditation as a cure for what ails us, right? And then finally, social reform. This is sort of an interesting one. And gender equality, right? We've seen these more traditional forms of Buddhism have pretty rigid hierarchies where men are at the top, women are at the bottom. And even within the men, there are various grades too. It's very regimented, very hierarchical. We Americans don't like that kind of thing, right? And that's one reason I harped on it so much at the beginning, is because, you know, the Morris daughters scene and all that sort of stuff is pretty uncomfortable according to our modern standards. And so, you know, this is something we might even agree with. Like, yeah, maybe we should have some more of that, right? That social reform kind of thing. And, you know, this is a hot topic in the Catholic Church, right? Is to what degree should we modernize the Catholic Church and bring in more egalitarianism, more gender equality in the leadership roles? Okay, so this is a review. Any questions about this? Buddhist modernism. I'm asking you to write about this tonight. That's why I'm giving you this list. It'll give you a sense of what it is, right? What is Buddhist modernism? Again, you could use Headspace as a representative of Buddhist modernism too. So Yeah, and Gleig, find something in here. There's a lot going on. There's also, so this, might not seem so bad, right? We were saying social reform, gender equality, like those, I think a lot of us would argue are pretty good things. You guys agree with me, right? But there's also this white supremacy undercurrent, which I think cannot be ignored. And so what's that all about? Maybe I can show this slide. So Gleig basically says we need to rethink this American meditation-based convert Buddhism, right? That's kind of her thesis, or at least in the second half of the chapter we read. Why does she argue that? Why do we need to rethink, and then these are a lot of adjectives, why do we need to rethink the American meditation-based convert Buddhism? What's wrong with that formulation? And so this is where you could criticize Buddhist modernism, right? If you want to argue against it. You could, and Gleig in many ways is, it's not like a really forcibly argued take, which again is, I would argue, an elegant way to make an argument, is to understate it a little bit, but let the evidence speak for itself. We live in a world where everybody's loud with no evidence. But really the more effective way to argue is the opposite, is to be a bit more quiet with your argument, but provide overwhelming evidence. So why does she make this argument that we need to rethink American meditation-based convert Buddhism? What does it do? What does this do to Buddhism in America? How does this tie to white supremacy? And again, this is an argument, right? She has a thesis statement. Remember how I'm always badgering you guys to make thesis statements? She has a thesis statement and she's trying to support it. You don't have to even necessarily agree with her, but it's important to understand the argument regardless of whether you agree with her or not, right? Because you got to understand first, and then if you disagree, you can say, here's why I disagree. This piece of information doesn't quite jive with what I understand, or whatever. So what's the problem with this? Well, as often is the case, the answer to the question I'm posing is a little bit lower in the slide. What is the split between essential Dharma and cultural Buddhism? What's that talking about? Jocelyn? Okay. So we're thinking about American Buddhism, right? We've got American here. That's our question is, what is American Buddhism, right? And what Jocelyn is saying, early in the history of Buddhism in America, there were these monks coming over from all over the place, not just monks, but lay people too, Buddhists coming from all over the world. They're putting in hard work and trying to set up this religion here, right? And I mentioned that podcast, right? And so that was one example of a monk trying to, well, he wasn't a monk, he's more like a priest, trying to set up Buddhism in America. And one thing it makes you think about is, is America a Christian nation? Why not? Church and state are separated, right? This is the land of the free. I mean, I was really quite moved when I was walking to class today. I was listening to this podcast about somebody who was trying to spread Buddhism to America, and he got put in an internment camp. Do you guys know this history? So Japanese Americans during World War II were put in internment camps on an order created by FDR after Pearl Harbor, right? So it was a similar moment of, let's just call it Asian hate, right? So a similar moment where Americans were rallying against a very specific ethnic group, Asians. Many Chinese were mistaken for Japanese. They were probably not put in internment camps, but they almost certainly were attacked. And so what does it mean to be in an internment camp? You're in a prison, with lots of other Japanese people. The only thing you have done wrong is to be Japanese, which of course is not doing anything wrong. And it's easy to sort of see this history and think, oh, America is so messed up, right? It's so bigoted. It is so, it's so stacked against certain groups. But like Brendan is saying, look at our laws. We are the land of the free, right? We are founded on religious freedom, aren't we? And so, I looked up at an American flag. It was just hanging over the street. And I was like, oh my goodness, right? We are founded on really enlightened principles. It doesn't have to be this way where we exclude one group to emphasize another. And in fact, our enlightened founders of this country, for all of their shortcomings, and of course they did have many, this idea of freedom is a beautiful idea, right? And it is baked into the foundations of this country. So, coming back to this, does Buddhism have to be a realm of white supremacy? Absolutely not. Absolutely not, right? We are founded on principles of inclusion, of openness, of opportunity, aren't we? Isn't that what America stands for? I know it's easy to forget that over the last 4 years, but that, the last 4 years are not what America is about. I can't help but get a little bit political here because white supremacy is a political issue, right? So in any case, we talked about cultural articulation versus racial articulation. I'm not even going to look it up again. You can look it up. It's on page 44. The difference, well, maybe I got to ask you, do you remember what the difference between those two things is? Do you remember what this idea of racial rearticulation is referring to? I'll just bring up a word that it uses, is racial hegemony. I'm pretty sure hegemony is in there. Actually, maybe I should look it up just to make sure I'm not teaching you fancy words that you don't need to know. Racial rearticulation, yeah. So the end of the definition, it uses the word racial hegemony. Have you ever heard of hegemony before? I'll write it in the chat. Hegemony. Hegemonic, hegemony. Hegemony. So it just refers to, it's a power dynamic. So let's see what it says. Leadership or dominance, especially by one country or social group over others, right? So what is racial hegemony? It just means one racial group is at the top, right? And so in terms of this Buddhist modernism, what would racial hegemony look like? It means the white people are in charge, right? The white people are the important group. And so when we make this split between an essential Dharma and a cultural Buddhism, it's basically saying the essential one is this one white group. Again, it doesn't have to be this way, but this is one way that it manifests. And I've seen it with in my own life. There's this essential group of white Buddhists, and then there's sort of the cultural baggage of the immigrant Buddhists, right? It's dismissive of an entire group of Buddhists. Again, doesn't have to be this way, but Glieg is arguing that this American meditation-based convert Buddhism, which again was invented by Buddhists themselves, by people who weren't even born or living in America. This is coming from members of British colonies. So as usual, we can probably blame the British in a very foundational way. I think we can all agree they messed up the world, right? No, that was a bad joke. But this split between an essential Dharma and a cultural Buddhism ends up kind of taking on the characteristics of racial splits, as often happens in America. Okay, so it's basically an overview, and I wanted to give you some hope. I think we didn't have time for this video, so why don't we watch it?
Go to temple every week.
So we created the Young Buddhist editorial.
Sound real quick. It's a very short video.
Our journeys changed.
And we couldn't go to temple every week.
So we created the Young Buddhist editorial,
a nationwide community
to share Buddhist stories and experiences. Together, let's give back to the community who made us who we are today.
So did they say we're sad because we couldn't meditate by ourselves in our room? No, what are they talking about? Coming together, community, groups, social groups, right? We don't have to trap ourselves in this horrible cycle of self-care, right? It's not your responsibility and yours alone to care for yourself. I know that's the message that is blasted at you at all times, that no one will care for you in this cold world of ours. There is another way. I know you probably know this in a certain degree. We can care for each other, right? This is an option. And this is what is lost in the meditation-based vision, right? It becomes sort of a form of therapy. People go in just trying to fix themselves because they know the world will not fix them. But there is another way to live in this world and to relate to one another. And that is a part of Buddhism. And that is a part of Buddhism that gets left out here. So that's something I want to focus on as we shift to Buddhist magic. So what is really missing here is this sense of community. I don't know if I spelled that out explicitly on this slide, but that's what I would say. So before we move on, any questions about Buddhist modernism. Do you feel like you're able to write about it? You have some hot takes? Okay. If you have hot takes, then why don't we move on? So last time I lectured mostly. Today I'm going to give you guys a chance to dig. So I hope you're ready to do that. So you can, start opening up your books or your printouts or your files or whatever it is, because I'm going to ask you to go through them. I'll just give you a very brief intro to what's going on here. I wrote about this in my review of the book. So if you're interested in this topic, you can read more about it there. But, around the time modernity sort of gets invented 100 plus years ago, 150 years ago, scholars of religious studies, I'm calling them Victorian anthropologists. Have you guys ever heard of this word, Victorian? What's that talking about? Yeah, good. And who is Victoria? Mm-hmm. England specifically. Yeah, so it's Queen Victoria. Yeah, and so just like Brendan's saying, late 19th century, that's when she was in charge. Victorian England, Victorian anthropology. So these were British anthropologists. And just like we were discussing a moment ago, or I was sort of ranting about a moment ago, the British took over the world, right? They had the biggest empire like in human history, basically. And so Victorian anthropology is basically, how do we think about the rest of the world? Anthropology, I'm sure you've heard this term before. Have you ever broken it down though? It's an ology. What is it an ology of? What is anthro? So that's biological anthropology, yes. What is it an ology of? They don't give it to us here. It's humans. People, man, right? It's an ology of man. And so anthropology actually has sort of a dark history, and this is too much of a tangent to go into, but it kind of built into eugenics, right? Is basically what are people, how do we classify them? And when you put it in a colonialist context, that's exactly what it becomes, is who are these people we have conquered? Let's study them, right? And so this is what they came up with, is we have science, we are rational and empirical. Religion has a little bit of a place here. Science was sort of new. Even people like Sir Isaac Newton or something, he was actually kind of an alchemist. I don't know if you guys know this about him, but he was like, trying to turn lead into gold and all that sort of thing. And he just happened to also be a genius and invent a bunch of physics stuff, or discover a bunch of physics stuff. So this split from science to religion is very recent. Like, again, about 150 years ago, people started to do this. And so religion was sort of on the way out, but there's still a value in it, right? Ethics and meaning, giving meaning to our lives, right? And so that's probably how a lot of you guys feel in this class. That's often how it's presented is, in this school, we educate the whole human, right? Not just your engineering class or your math class or whatever other class. We need to educate you with meaning and ethics, right? And that's why you come to my class. I'm the ethics guy. I don't know if I'm very ethical, to be honest, but I do my best, I suppose. And so that's sort of the place religion starts to take. It's not as good as science. It's a little more incorrect. There's more faith and belief, but there's still some meaning in there, right? What gets left out, left in the cold, is magic. And so maybe I can ask you guys, I have my thing about empiricism and rationality and whatever, but when you hear the word magic, what do you think of? Magic? I was watching basketball the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, Orlando Magic. That's the name of the team. The Washington Wizards. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and the Wizards were the team. But before they were the Wizards, they had another more violent name. Do you guys know what they used to be? The Bullets. Yeah, that's not going to fly in today's age, I suppose. But yeah, they became the Wizards, right? And so again, it is in our world, in our culture. Okay, so Cameron thinks of alchemy. I mentioned that Sir Isaac Newton was an alchemist. What is alchemy? You know what alchemy is, Cameron? What makes you think about alchemy?
So I read the book The Alchemist.
Okay.
And it's one of my favorite books. So that's what I think about. But basically it's like not sorcery, but it's like using materials to it's hard to explain, but like in the book The Alchemist, they use like rocks and like certain things to signify other things, and it's a sense of magic, but it's more on the terms of using materials like gold and stuff like that to signify other things.
Okay, so maybe some themes that Cameron's pointing out is symbols and meaning, right? So the material world around us, it's not just like disenchanted matter. It's not just cold, meaningless dust and space and all that sort of stuff. There's actually meaning in the things that are around us, right? And alchemy is interesting. Actually, I do research about alchemy. It's something I'm working on now. It's also proto-chemistry, right? That chem is in the middle. If you ever see a word that begins with al, it means it's actually a loan word from which language? Which language does alchemy come from? Algebra. What language?
Is it Arabic?
It is Arabic. Thank you. I was getting nervous. Yeah. So alchemy, alchemia, right? And so it's sort of an international tradition, transnational tradition, but the chem is chemistry, right? And so when we split magic from science, you get chemistry, and then you get alchemy. It sort of gets left behind. And like Cameron says, this is the pursuit of turning metal into gold. That's part of it, but also lots of other stuff, especially in the Arabic tradition, and as I'm doing research in Tibetan and Indian traditions, also in Chinese traditions. East Asia, they're also doing versions of alchemy too. Concerned with health, longevity, transformation, we could say, right? Transforming something into something else through manipulation of materials. So yeah, meaning, absolutely. Other things, where else does magic show up in our world, in our culture? I'm sure there are other examples we can come up with, right? And to be clear, very few people would raise their hand and say, I'm an alchemist, right? Those people are chemists now. They leave the al part out. I'm sure there's an alchemist out there somewhere, though. Maybe in a basement in New York somewhere, blowing stuff up. I don't know. Magic? Do you guys believe in magic? Isn't that a song? Do you believe in magic? And I hope you do. I feel like it's on an ad or something. Does magic show up in ads and entertainment? Where? Where does it show up? Yeah, that's what we're getting at. Yeah. What is it trying to catch you with? It's true. It does show up. I mentioned it's a basketball team. Harry Potter? Magic? Isn't Harry Potter all about magic? The Philosopher's Stone? That is an alchemical term, actually. That's what alchemists are looking for. It's how to turn metal into gold. I never read the Harry Potter books. I saw some of the movies. I was a little too old for it. It came out like when I was in high school, and I was like, I'm not so into this. But I'm sure if I were younger, I'd be more into it. So yeah, I guess one thing I want to list it out is it is a part of our pop culture. Whether you guys, it's too early for you guys to come up with examples, it seems. But magic shows. You ever been to a magic show? Magic tricks. You guys know any good magic tricks? No magic tricks? It's good to learn some magic tricks. You can amuse your friends with them. I learned some card tricks. I wasn't very good at them, but it was like some way of, I don't know, slipping the card that's supposed to be theirs on the back of the deck and showing it to him, and then I can look at it, and then he kind of slip it back in. It's like, is this your card? And then of course I'd already seen it on the back of the deck. So magic is here, right? It's in our pop culture, but it's been sort of declawed. So what do I mean by that? It's sort of this fun game. We can use it in a commercial. Maybe there's a little bit of an appeal, like, yeah, magic, that's sort of fun. But nobody takes it seriously, right? Alchemy is a nice book, but there are very few alchemists who are actually trying to create gold that way anymore, right? As a sort of useful pursuit, it has mostly lost its place in our world. And so what I'm trying to do in this class today is let us rethink that. And it's going to be weird and uncomfortable, but bear with me. What is life if not weird and uncomfortable? So here's what I want you to do. Maybe I'll introduce the book before we get into it. So this is a book translated by a colleague of mine, Sam Schkeik. It's a very rare manuscript. It only exists in one copy. As you can tell, it's sort of this long book. It's a codex, which means it has a spine here. It's like glued together. It's written in Tibetan. This is the handwriting. Sort of hard to read. It's this archaic language. It's about 1,000 years old, right? 10th century. It's about 1,000 years old. It was found in a cave in the desert a place called Dunhuang in northwestern China. And it's just this glimpse into what does religious practice look like in Tibet 1,000 years ago, right? And you know, when doing historical research, this stuff, we were just talking about gold, this is gold, right? Because this is a direct glimpse. It was hidden in a cave and then uncovered 100 years ago, brought to the British Library, again, colonialism. And so now polite people like Sam Van Skyke and me can go through these things and figure out what they say. They've been digitized. So I have this whole book on my hard drive. So it's a book of spells and ritual instructions. Here's sort of the table of contents. And basically what I want you to do is go through them and look for healing, right? So what are some examples of healing in this book? This is a more interesting question. What is the logic? And I would argue that there is a logic. I don't think I actually quite explained this part. Empirical just means it's observed, right? So I'll give you an example. Have you ever heard that walnuts are good for your brain? You've never heard that before? Oh, I see some nods. Why would a walnut be good for your brain? It looks like a brain. Yes, you guys knew this one. Good. You break it open, it looks like a brain. Now, a dietitian, a scientist would say, ah, that is superstition, right? And they would blow it off. But of course, we followers of magical traditions say, okay, it looks like a brain and therefore it's good for your brain, right? So there is a logic there. You might think it is faulty logic. You don't happen to necessarily agree with the logic, but it's important to recognize the logic. So that's one thing I want you to be able to do. So that would be called, there's a fancy term for it from these Victorian anthropologists, sympathetic magic, where something looks like something. Another example is like a voodoo doll, where if you make a voodoo doll, an effigy, you ever heard of effigies before? So if I give you a bad grade, you could make a little doll that looks like me and torture it somehow or something like that, right? So anyways, when things look like each other, that's part of this logic. We actually don't see too much of that in here. There's maybe a little bit. But look for the logic, right? That's where the more interesting conversation comes in. And sometimes you can't really answer it. So like I said, this is just a random old book that was found in a cave, right? And it doesn't always explain itself very well. So, but try to find the logic of these healing, of these spells, of these rituals. Think about, religious, scientific, or, how is magic different from those? I think from science, it's pretty easy to split, right? That's sort of what science is built on in a way. It's just not magic. But magic versus religion is sort of hard, actually. And I think that's one place where this book fails a little bit, is to differentiate the two. They're basically, for our purposes, very, very similar, very close. So that's something you can think about. And then finally, bring it into COVID, right? Because that's what you're going to write about tonight is, first of all, do we have any magical thinking in our own response to COVID? And what was the last part? Yeah, could any of these rituals be adapted for our current situation? Sort of an interesting thought. And again, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to open up to the first one and you'll be like, are they talking about stabbing someone? This is so weird. And I will say, yes, it is weird. But at the same time, give it a chance, right? Because this is pushing against what we expect, right? We expect sort of this nice, polite, modern, essential Buddhism, but this is real. We don't know how popular this was because, again, we just have one copy of this book, but it's there, right? And so we can choose to ignore it if we want, but then we wouldn't get a very full picture of Buddhism if we did that. So these are my questions for you. Do you have any questions for me? Chat, you guys good? Yeah, I feel like it's been a while since. So bizarre, yeah. Yeah, definitely not science, right? So when you have these Buddhists coming up 100 years ago and being like, yeah, Buddhism's science, they're very actively suppressing this sort of stuff, right? They're definitely leaving this out. So let's get into the specifics, because that's the hard part. In writing and in speaking, it's very easy to make general statements, right? But let's come up with the example. So where does it become sort of drift away from science? What examples did you talk about?
It seems like they take an adjective and a noun, and then they say, do the mantra 21 times, and whatever famous cause, they move up.
Okay.
Like,
I think it.
Very
I think that in the Avalokiteshvara cycle, there's a lot of that, right? I don't know if that was where you guys were looking, but that's more of a grab bag where it's like, yeah, if you have this problem, then do this. If you have that problem, then do that. Yeah, so Avalokiteshvara, I got a slide for him. That's actually, maybe you remember the Sanskrit name for Guanyin. I know I've hit you with a lot of Buddhists. Actually, I've been pretty sparse with the Bodhisattvas. It's still been a lot, but there are a lot more. This again is the Bodhisattva of compassion. This is a he instead of a she. I introduced him as a her before. Remember the Bodhisattva in the moon? I was looking after the little monk. Remember that one? So same figure here, but different form. 11 heads, 1,000 arms. Maybe if you look carefully at that part, you notice there was talk of 1,000 arms. Did you pick up on that? So here's what it looks like. Sometimes people do performances of this where like 10 people stand in a single file and stick their arms out in interesting ways. Have you ever seen that before? So that is inspired by this figure, right? Having 1,000 arms, reaching out in all different directions to help people, right? A very compassionate motivation. What we see here has very little to do with Avalokiteshvara. It could have been any deity, really. As we were saying, it's sort of miscellaneous, but we see lots of random stuff. Here's one that I pulled out. Mantra 21 times, just like Brendan said, applied to the surface of the skin, and the disease will come out. So there's a sense, if we're thinking about the logic, what is the disease? It's a physical substance. Did you notice that? The thing that's in a body that needs to be extracted from the body. And how do you do that? Is you use what? Leaves. I think I might have a typo here. That leaves marks like iron. Oh no, that's talking about the disease still. Crush a red cherry tree leaf, grind it into a paste. So you make a paste, you say the mantra, you put it on the skin. Does this feel like medicine? At least a little bit? What's medicinal about this? So Brielle's kind of splitting it into two parts, right? And I like your thinking. This is what, if we were scientists, this is something we could do, is we could say, okay, what are they talking about? They're talking about a red cherry tree leaf. Let's go to Central Eurasia, because we know where this came from, right? This came from a cave in the middle of the desert. Let's go there, find this leaf, crush it into a paste, and give it a try, right? We have to know what the skin disease is. So, you know, a lot of questions still here. But a lot of scientists take this sort of thing and say, all right, we'll get rid of that mantra stuff, because who needs that? But we can find the active ingredient, isolate it, and try to make some money off of it, right? It's the American way. And so this is something that people do. And in fact, people have won Nobel Prizes for this sort of work, going through old texts, finding these formulae, usually getting rid of the mantras. This is, you know, sort of an open question now about whether there's any use to them or not. But like Brielle said, there's sort of two sides to this, right? On the one hand, something we could call scientific, especially if there is some sort of active ingredient that cures whatever skin this disease is. But it's also steeped in mantras and magic too at the same time, just like alchemy, right? It's chemistry, but it's also magic and mantras and that sort of stuff too. Good. Let's see. Afterwards, can you elaborate on the aggressive part? Yeah, people are curious about stabbing. So that was the first example. So let's talk about that. We got 10 minutes, so plenty of time. Here is the ritual dagger. It's called a porbu. It's called a kila in Sanskrit. Tibetan is porbu. The only reason I tell you that is because Sam Vanishkai uses both of those words. And as you can see, pretty mean looking, huh? Right? Like, look at this face here. Like, that's not a kind and gentle face. And we've seen a face that looks like that before. Remember the Vajra guy who's holding the Vajra in his hand? Similar sort of figure here. It's a badass, right? And I told you, this is a good guy. This dagger is a good guy, right? And so why do we need these badass good guys? Who do they fight against? Who do you think they fight against here? We're getting at the logic of this one. So just very simply put, you've got what's being called an insane person. You kind of tie him up, hold him down, stab them, let's see, stab the afflicted person with 5 porbu, right? These ritual daggers, pressing on their 4 limbs and head. So, so it's multiple daggers, if I'm reading this correctly, with 5 porbu. So you're stabbing them in 5 different places all at the same time, the extremities. So 4 limbs plus the head. What is going on here? And just to be clear, somebody brought up bloodletting, and that's sort of an interesting one. In traditional medicine across Eurasia, like not just in any one particular place, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere in between, the bloodletting was practiced. Why would they practice it? Because blood was one of the humors. Have you ever heard of humors before? Like, you could say someone is humorous. That's not what this is talking about, though. It's not talking about jokes. Humors are what your body is composed of. So in the Greek humors, there was black bile, yellow bile, so 2 kinds of bile, bloodletting, and phlegm. And so if you have too much blood, it's a seasonal thing, I think around now, actually. You're supposed to let the blood out to sort of make yourself healthy. If you have too much blood, there's a sense like if your blood is stagnant and you have too much blood, you got to let it out. And that would make you healthy. Now, there are similar practices. Have you guys ever heard of cupping before? So one way to do cupping is to let blood with it. There's a sense that there's stagnant blood in your back or in your arms. If you ever see athletes with big, weird bruises on their arms, they're not actually letting the blood, but they're still doing the cupping exercise. So it's sort of making a comeback. If you call it bloodletting, people are like, no, it's not bloodletting. But if you look at the history of it, of course I have, it's the same stuff, same theory, same idea. It's manipulating the humors, one of which is blood, inside the body. So this is not that, though. This is different. They don't talk about the humors. They don't talk about the movement of the various bodily constituents. What is causing this disease here? Do we have a sense of it? What is the logic of this one? I don't know if it's totally clear from the text itself. The introduction makes it pretty clear, though, doesn't it? So if you look this, if you can't understand the text, the introduction helps. I'll find it for you. On 131, for example, at the very top of 131, a metal ritual dagger, just like the one we saw here, was probably used in this quote-unquote stabbing, is almost certainly not intended to wound. It is mainly a symbolic act. 2 much briefer rituals for insanity occur later in the next section of the Book of Spells, and both are described as quote-unquote stabbing at the ailment, even though they do not explicitly mention the use of the porbu, which again is this thing, being mainly based on burning incense. So they're stabbing at the ailment. What is the ailment then? Can we make sense of this now? Have you guys ever wanted to stab COVID? I think we all do at this point. I was having a fantasy of like a giant COVID piñata, you know, like a big COVID ball with a little crown sticking out and just smashing the crap out of that thing. There's something very similar happening here, right? We're all a little tense right now, aren't we? I'm a little tense. I don't know about you guys. I'm not always this intense, but I've become more intense in the last year. I think we're all sort of just ratcheted up a notch. We're seeing Americans killing each other all over the goddamn place. I hate to say it, but it's true. And, you know, maybe what we need is just a good old-fashioned ritual stabbing. Now, we're not here to hurt each other, right? Just let off some steam. No, I think that is one way to sort of think about it, at least, though, is you take the ailment and turn it into something you can deal with, right? Does COVID really exist as like a piñata ball that we can smash? Of course not, right? It's operating through symbols. It's giving us the tools to materialize. There's a special word, reify, turn something into a thing, turn the disease, turn the ailment into a thing, and then deal with it, right? And again, sometimes, especially with this sort of magical tantra stuff, sometimes you need to be fierce when you have these ailments. There's a similar logic happening. That one's sort of interesting. This one's interesting too. There's so many interesting ones. There's one I have in mind. I forget exactly where it was. Let's talk about the frog and the dragon. Maybe this one. Yeah, let's talk about the Garuda. So again, lots of things. You can look through the slides. They're there to help you. Let me introduce you to my friend Garuda. So Here's another fierce looking deity, right? Kind of a badass. Can you tell what this is? What's going on with its face? What do you see here? It's on fire. That's
Is that
classic.
tongue sticking out?
It looks like maybe a tongue. This is actually a snake. This is a beak. It's a bird. It's a bird spirit. So its name is Garuda. Garuda is the name of a kind of a mythological bird. Donna Lisa pointed out connections to Hinduism. Garuda is also in Hinduism. What's the relationship between birds and snakes? Are they friends? Maybe this is something we don't learn in biology class, but birds eat snakes. That's what he's doing here. Why do you think it matters that he's eating a snake? How do you think pre-modern people felt about snakes? Did they like snakes? Do you guys like snakes? What's wrong with snakes? Why don't we like snakes? Is it creepy? Snakes are the devil? Yeah, and as you can see here, snakes are kind of the devil here too. What's wrong with snakes? Biologically, what's wrong with snakes? Why evolutionarily speaking, do humans hate snakes? I think this is a fact that we just are scared of them. Why have we been biologically programmed to hate snakes? Because they bite us, right? And they make you sick when they bite you. I mean, we don't necessarily use the language of sick, but they poison your ass, right? And so in the Himalayas, this was a problem. So what do when somebody gets poisoned? Call on your friend, the Garuda, to protect you. There was talk of dragons too. So if you encounter dragons, are dragons like snakes? In European traditions, in a way, the answer is no. But in China, have you ever seen a Chinese dragon, East Asian dragon? They're actually much more serpent-like. They have much longer tails. It translates the Sanskrit word naga. So those, Buddhist scripture, if it says naga, it turns into long in Chinese. So that same concept. In Tibetan, it's called le, and this is what they look like, at least in Tibet. They have these long serpentine tails, but then sort of the body of a humanoid figure. And so again, this is how these spirits are represented, and they're thought of making us sick as well. Now, if the le, right, if these serpent spirits, if these dragons are what make us sick, then we got to call on the Garuda to protect us. And that's what we see for this poisoning ritual, right? You visualize this white nectar and basically recite the mantra, and the Garuda comes in to help too. There's this whole thing about mirror divination. Actually, I wrote an article about this. Again, I've read this text pretty carefully. I could go on and on about that, but we don't really have time. Another thing that's sort of part of this dragon serpent world is also frogs. Sometimes frogs poison people, right? And so there's this practice of taming dragons and using frogs to draw out a disease. So one piece that maybe you can take away from this is diseases are turned into objects. They're turned into things that we can interact with, things that we can track, things that we can manipulate, right? There's something you can do about it. Rather than just staying at home and feeling helpless all the time like we do now, these give you tools to create a thing, turn the disease into a thing, and then do something with that thing. So you can look at specific examples, use the slides to help you, right? I make the slides for you, so download them, look at them. We don't have time now, we're out of time. So feel free to email me if you have any questions, and good luck. Happy writing. I hope you have fun with the assignment.